So just when you think that all the news headlines are crowding out Ukraine because Israel and Palestine, what's going on in Gaza Strip, and Hamas and Hezbollah is sucking up all the energy, you can still count on Russian state media to talk about how Ukraine must be destroyed. So here we are. This is recent. And here's Sergei Mardan saying that Russia must bury Ukraine. That's the headline in the Russian media monitor. We'll just see what kind of nutty things he has to say. Special thanks to the Russian media monitor for doing this excellent work. Let's look at what we can see. Before we start to discuss what's considered important by a great majority of Russia's media resources, which I find incredibly surprising, to be honest, it feels like everything came to an end on Saturday. Yeah, that's a really interesting observation because last Saturday it just changed. The narrative changed. All our attention shifted to Israel, and while my attention went more to Russia than ever before to see what's Russia saying about what's going on in Israel and Ukraine and whatever, it has shifted dramatically. Our eyes came off Ukraine in a significant way, and it shouldn't. As though we've already run and the Russian flag is flying on the building of the Supreme Council of the Soviet Ukrainian Republic. He's saying we've taken our eyes off the ball as if the Russian flag is flying over Ukraine. Like, think about that. Think about what he's saying. He's saying that's kind of the end goal, or that should have been the end goal, or, okay. Ukraine's independence monument was blown up and work underway to erect another monument. Wow. I mean, think about what he's saying about what he thinks should happen in Ukraine here. This is what it felt like since Saturday. This is it. Now we're immersed in the events in the Middle East. To the north of that, pardon my routine statement, but in the last 24 hours, the Ukrainian army launched 65 missiles at the Belgorod region, Russia's Belgorod region. Yeah, I mean, things are still going on. The Advika offensive by Russia has been a train wreck, and it's barely being covered. Now, there are some channels like Combat Vet Reacts, and Dennis is still on this, and reporting from Ukraine are still covering that. But most of our attention has gone to Israel, and that's unfortunate. Go look at what's happened in Advika, and it looks like Russia's been pretty well hammered. It doesn't mean Ukraine hasn't suffered losses, but Russia's been like pretty bad in Advika. Okay, let's get back to this. It was a routine daily shelling. The region was also attacked by more than 20 drones. Also a routine attack on the most prosperous, one of the richest Russian regions. I'm constantly repeating this, and I will keep repeating it. We have to remember everything has a price. This is the price for not ending the war in 3 days. Well, that's really interesting. Do you think you could have ended the war in 3 days? Do you think that that was in the cards? Now, he talks about 3 days. I'm not putting words in his mouth. Every time I mention 3 days or 3 weeks, and there's evidence that they thought in 3 days they were going to, beat a Kyiv. In 3 weeks, they were going to mop up and be over it. You know how many days, like 600 days later, you still can't finish a 3-week war. That's a bad look. So you shouldn't have started that war. Or even in 3 months. Okay, let's use 3 months as the barometer. This is daily shelling of the Belgorod region is the price that we are paying. Our army is fighting. It is fighting well. It's actually not fighting very well at all. It's got behind defensive lines right now, and because of the defensive lines, it's slowed down everything significantly. But when it came out into Russia's offensive at Advika, it did not demonstrate that it was awesome. Let's put it that way. I hope these dirtbags who settled in Advika will be leveled in a similar way. I hope they'll be leveled with 3-ton bombs, the way Israel is leveling Gaza right now. Okay, that's an interesting tie. You really aren't able to do it, though, or you would have. So if you could have done it in 3 days, if you could have leveled Advika, if you could have done these other things, what's stopping you? There's no, is it just that you're so concerned about the lives of your brother Ukrainians that you're not doing it? Or is something else at play? Are you unable or incapable of actually doing those things that you want to do? of putting the Russian flag over the capital in Ukraine, of putting up your own Russian monument to replace the Independence Monument. They have their own enemies. Their enemy is Hamas. For us, our enemy is exactly like Hamas is for Israel. Whoa, what a statement. So your enemy is like Hamas is for Israel. So Ukrainians are pouring over the border, cutting up Russians and hacking them to death. Is that what you're trying to say? Because those are pretty different kind of things. They are soldiers of Ukraine's armed forces, or rather any person who has a yellow-blue patch. This is our own Hamas. Okay, and I understand you're trying to tie these together by saying that these Ukrainians over here are bad and we are good. But they're not the same. This is apples and watermelons. It's not even apples and oranges. This is the entire logic of it. But the fact that the shelling of Belgorod has become routine and is of no interest to anyone is categorically wrong. This shouldn't become routine. Well, I would agree. It shouldn't become routine, nor should the shelling of innocent civilians within Ukraine become routine, nor should this be overlooked because of what's going on in Israel. But the media's attention has been diverted, shifted away from what's going on in Ukraine over to Israel. It's become the bigger story, and it shouldn't. This is still very significant, and we should not forget about what's going on in Ukraine. Everyone is busy figuring out what's happening in the Middle East, what is happening in Palestine. Of course, all of this is interesting, but what's more interesting is the clear understanding that there in Israel, in Palestine, and when I say Palestine, I mean the territory. I don't mean a nation which currently does not exist. Okay, so what we will call historic Israel, he's going to call historic Palestine, and that's going to be part of the narrative that changes and shows you what their position is, because they're saying Palestine as if we're talking about the same land, right? And he's only going to talk about Palestine, not about Israel, and that's really interesting. Okay, what's being decided between the Jews and Arabs is an agrarian question: who will bury whom? For approximately 5,000 years, different generations, different nations are deciding a purely agrarian question: who will bury whom? What is happening between us and the nation by the name of Ukraine? Now, you see what he just did there? He was saying, like, not using the name of the other one, just saying the area of, and then he's linking that kind of logic to what's happened with this area called Ukraine. It's not really Ukraine. It's not its own nation. It's this area that they're calling that as if it's not real. And that's part of the standard Russian talking point, that Ukraine is not its own place. It's just this, they've just arbitrarily called it this nation, and it's really part of Greater Russia. Is approximately the same thing. Either we will bury this nation, or the powers that created Ukraine, fostered it, raised it up, will try to bury us. Okay, that's another standard Russian talking point. The forces that created Ukraine, as if it wasn't Ukraine having some agency, it's just Western powers. It's the United States behind the curtain pulling the strings on Ukraine. They don't really want to be their own nation, but the United States wants to make them that. Ha 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 ha. Okay, but they will try to bury us. So it's an existential threat now. It's not even a special military operation. It's now, we got to do something about that. Well, you do have to do something about that because you kind of stumbled into a hornet's nest. They aren't even hiding it, which is good and correct. Meanwhile, we keep being shy. Shy? For a year and a half, we can't formulate what we really want. No, you formulated what you really want. You just can't perform it. You don't have the power to actually take this country that's so much smaller than you, a third of your population, a smaller fraction of GDP, and you haven't been able to take them. That's the reality. Okay, so that's it. I fundamentally agree with his analysis that we need to keep our eye on what's going on in Ukraine. For very different reasons, but we need to keep our eye on what's going on in Ukraine. And I promise I will. I'm not going to just move away and go into Israel analysis, although that's important. It's not as important as what's happening in Ukraine geopolitically. Like, Ukraine has the potential, the war between Russia and Ukraine, to kick off World War III. I'm not sure that you would see that kind of level of danger happening in Israel. When I say that, I'm not saying Israel's not important. I'm just saying I think Ukraine has more is a greater powder keg for the rest of the world, and we need to keep our eye on the ball. Okay, tell me what you think. I'm curious about your thoughts. Put them in the comments. Thank you for your time, the likes, the shares, the subscribes, the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.